So, hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to this event. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. Thank you for joining in person at Neste's office and also online. I know there are many of you who have chosen to join online, so thanks a lot for that. I'm very excited to be chairing this event to mark the publication of a new report entitled Transforming Early Childhood, Narrowing the Gap Between Children from Lower and Higher Income Families, authored by Kathy Silva and Naomi Eisenstadt and funded by Nesta. So in this report, Naomi and Kathy set their vision for transforming early childhood provision to give a fairer start to children to reach their life's chances. We have an amazing set of speakers today. And first, we have our two authors, Naomi and Kathy. So Kathy is an honorary research fellow and professor of educational psychology at the University of Oxford. She has led longitudinal studies on the effects of early childhood education on children's development, as well as intervention studies on parental support programs. She's done a huge amount of work on education for disadvantaged children. She's also a fellow of the British Academy, the Academy of Social Sciences, and the British Psychological Society. And this other second author of the report is Naomi Eisenstadt, who is currently chair of the NHS Northamptonshire Integrated Care Board. Naomi has a long and distinguished career in public policy. Notably, she became director of Sure Start Unit in 1999, which was the unit responsible for delivering the government's commitment to free nursery education places, the National Childcare Strategy, and the Sure Start program. And she also spent 3 years heading the Social Exclusion Task Force. And since leaving the civil service, Naomi has served as an advisor on poverty for the First Minister of Scotland and published 2 books. We will also be joined a little bit later in the event by 2 other great speakers, Mike Brewer and Professor Iram Siraj, who I will introduce a bit more fully later once they're on stage and people online can see them better. But they will join our panel discussion. Both of them also have done a huge amount of work on the topics covered by the report. So the event will start with a 15-minute presentation by the authors of the report, which will be followed by a panel discussion, and I will ask Mike and Iram to start with their opening reflections, and we'll follow that with a discussion. And then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience, both here and also online. For those online, please write your comments and questions in the comments box on YouTube or LinkedIn. And I just wanted to remind you that there are also closed captions available on the LinkedIn stream. So without further ado, let me hand over to Kathy and Naomi for their opening presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's wonderful to see so many friends in the audience. Our brief was to study the research and policies in order to make recommendations for new policies and services that would narrow the gap between the bottom 40% of family income and the top 60%. The moment that we were to have narrowed the gap was the foundation stage, and we would have written a different kind of report had we had a goal of mental health or adolescent as the outcome. So first, we described what we think all children need to thrive, and we talked about families. And next, we considered why it's more difficult for children in families in the lower 40% of income to thrive. And then in the end, we make recommendations. So why is it harder for children in the bottom 40%? What children need, all children need, is warmth and security in the family. There's a huge, strong attachment literature in psychology. but they also need challenge. They need challenge to their thinking. They need challenge to their concentration. And there's, again, a huge, very secure literature in psychology, but also in early education. So in addition to poor housing and insecure employment, which we could not deal with, there are many other problems of children in the lower 40% of income. To begin with, they live with parents who are more stressed. Middle-class parents are stressed, but these families have fewer resources to deal with that stress. They have more parental discord, a lot connected with low income. They have poorer mental health, and they have lower levels of education. And just a quick anecdote about lower levels of education. A child in the bottom 40% of income is statistically more likely to hear the sentence, "Go get your wellies." A child in the top 60%, but particularly the top 20%, is more likely to, statistically more likely, to hear the sentence, "If I were you, I would march into the kitchen, get my wellies, and bring them back right to this door." So think of that sentence. I think of it as brain gym. It's not just a more sophisticated vocabulary. I'd march. Who marches? Armies march. If I were you, and first I'd do this, and then I would do this. This is brain gym. Every day, children having these kinds of conversations are stretching their minds. And when they get to school, they are making a really strong start. Okay, our recommendations are two-pronged. A, to improve early education and care, which is combined with increased financial support for families of young children. Okay, that was the child and the family. Okay, focus on learning. Early childhood, as we know, is a unique phase in learning and in education. In the 20th century, the literature was very clear by the end of the century, the effects of early education. It's not just in this country, 4 countries of the United Kingdom, it's all over the world. In the 21st century, however, the argument and the data became more nuanced. It's not just attending early education, it's attending education with high quality. Okay. At the heart of high quality is intentional pedagogy, and in our report we go into a little detail about intentional pedagogy. It's knowing where each child is at in their development, in physical development, emotional development, cognitive development, where they can get, what are the next stages, and it's knowing how to move that child, explicit planning strategies for moving the child from where they are to the next stage. And not only plan the strategies, implement the strategies, go back and see did they work, and then planning the next. That's what is intentional pedagogy. And I'll give a quick example from an observation I made in a nursery school where I'm governor. Level 3 staff are really good at skills because they are trained in FE between the ages of 16 and 19 in skills. They have skilled performance. And so the educator asked the children, after they had read a story, were reading a story, what's going to happen next? This is a skill that you can train somebody, not easily, but many level 3 staff have this skill to ask a child what will happen next. Okay, this was a level 7 educator who is not just skilled, but also a reflective practitioner who'd been trained in a university, trained in critical thinking, trained in psychology, trained in stages, and knew these children and knew this child's interests. So the little girl, Sarah, who had predicted what would happen next, this is the example of really exquisite pedagogy. The educator said, "Why do you think that, Sarah?" And think of that. That's on the same order as this, "If I were you, I'd march into the kitchen." It's really making a challenge for the child. And so Sarah had to think back. What was it in the story? Okay, intentional pedagogy. So we argue in our paper that level 3 must be the basic grade for everybody, and they are skills, but that reflective practice and intentional educators are what we need. Okay, so I've done children and the family, focus on learning, focus on the system. We have a mixed economy, and we said this is where we are, and this is where we would plan from. The youngest children are most often found in the PVI sector. Oldest children in reception class are almost entirely in the maintained sector. So there is a gradual shift now from the PVI into maintained. In our recommendations, which Naomi will discuss later, we argue that that shift should come even earlier into the maintained, particularly for disadvantaged children. All sectors are struggling, but the PVI is struggling the most. Qualifications are falling more rapidly. There are now more level 2s. Turnover is greater in the PVI, and there are many closures up and down the country. So quality is highest in the maintained, and so we recommend, particularly the most disadvantaged children, that they be in the maintained sector from the age of 2. So all children need teacher-led early education, but those from the poorest families need it most. Now, whoops. Okay. These are the entitlements. This is an entitlement system based on balancing the needs of working parents for flexibility and coverage with the developmental needs of young children. So there's no entitlement in the first year because there's parental leave for 12 months. There is between 1 and 2, there's free entitlement, ECE, for 48 weeks a year for children whose parents are in work, education, or training. Beginning at the age of 2, there's free ECE for all children from 24 months to school entry, and 48 weeks of the year, 20 hours a week. So where is the evidence? There's very strong evidence for education from 2. Very strong evidence that disadvantaged children benefit more from that. And Naomi will, I think, justify our wanting to have entitlement in the first year. So also, our services would include a strong child-minding sector, because there is evidence that for very young children particularly, individual care at homes. So I have had the child in the family, poverty, learning, and then the system and where we are, and these are our entitlements. And I pass on now to Naomi.
Right. Thank you very much, Kathy. I always love the stories. I mean, the stories about the children and the learning, just, for decades. Kathy is so very, very good at that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the other side of the author. I mean, what Kathy is talking mainly about is how do we build the quality into the early years sector, in the sense that the quality has been, because qualifications are going down, certainly quality is going down, and quality is the most important thing for poor kids. But I also think there's another part of the picture, which is the family support. And so one of our big recommendations, the third from the bottom, is a new model of integrated family support at neighborhood level. And I suppose it's not new, it's invigorated, but I suppose, what did we learn from Sure Start? I mean, one of the things that always frustrates me is that everybody talks about bring it back, and they have a different think bubble in their head about what it is. And what I try to concentrate is, what did we learn that we didn't do well enough? So I think integrated family support at neighborhood level is enormously important. The things that we didn't do well enough was balance the concentration on mainly mothers and fathers with concentration on the child. And that's why our recommendations in this make it clear that we think that for good integrated family support, you need good early childhood education on site. So that the mothers who come with their babies, when they have their first year of paid maternity leave, 12 months, second recommendation, will see what it's like, and that children go and that it's okay and they look happy. It makes a huge difference. Some Sure Starts had it, some didn't, but that balance between a community development approach, which is all about the adults, and what we know is good for children is really, really important. The second thing that we learned was about the really good programs, was about the quality of the leadership. And the quality of the leadership is about integrated services. It's not just about early education. It's about being able to talk to health visitors, being able to talk to speech therapists, being able to talk to youth workers in the area who may be working with teen parents. The quality of the leadership is being able to knit the services together. And that requires a level of skill that's actually quite difficult. And I think we didn't pay enough attention to. And I have to say, you'd be surprised I'm saying this, but I would give all credit to Andrea Leadsom, because one of her recommendations on Start for Life is building much more support for the leaders of the Start for Life program, which is really good. The third thing in terms of what we got wrong is how long it takes to get these centers up and running and working properly. And oddly enough, I mean, what a problem to have how long it takes to spend the money. If only we had that problem now. So there is a very different situation right now. I would say that one of the things that we got right were the reciprocity of relationship with local parents. So a key feature in our New Children Campus model is that in governance terms, local parents have to be involved. But we also need local data to know who isn't coming, because that was, again, a big problem, was getting health services to share data. If you know who's not coming, you can do assertive outreach. It makes a huge difference. The problem with engaging parents in the governance is you only have the parents who are physically there. You have to make sure you do the outreach work. And the last thing about what's really important, there's the data, there's engaging parents and what's needed, but the reciprocity is almost personal. So the two examples I can give you is the one that many of you have heard me speak, my Telford Traveler example. So one of our first programs was one of the Trailblazers, was on a traveler site in Telford. It was a very well-maintained traveler site by the local authority. It had running hot water, it had washing machines, but it was the local authority, for good political reasons, put it away from all the other services in the town. There weren't even walkways to get into town. So it's very, very isolated. So in those days, we had advanced capital money, and the Sure Start manager went onto the site and said, well, what would you like? And they said, we'd like to have a children's play park at the back. There was an empty site. So the play park was built in 3 months. And it was the best working day of my life, because I got to cut the ribbon. And they were all thanking me. And I said, nope, it's not my money. It's not Tony Blair's money. It's your money. This is taxpayers' money. This is what we're spending it on. The most remarkable, the thing that really moved me the most was one of the mothers said to me, we've never been treated like normal people before. We've never been treated. She didn't use the word citizen, but that's what she meant. But the most amazing thing about it is that the program manager then arranged a bus service to take the children from the traveler site to nursery class. And the mothers put the children on the bus. I do not believe that those mothers would have put the children on the bus if the reciprocity, if what they said was important to them hadn't happened first. And I think that understanding of the context in which people live their lives, so my old joke was always, if you put the parenting program in a place where there's free laundrette, I'll come. If I can do my washing at the same time, I'll come. If you understand the context into which people live, that's what good integrated family services mean at local level. The penultimate recommendation, which I've referred to already, is that I think it's a mistake to have 9 months, to have free childcare from 9 months. And I think that you should create the conditions where you can have, we set up in the 2004 strategy 12 months leave with 9 months paid leave, with a policy intention to have 12 months paid leave by the end of the Parliament, and then 2008 happened and we couldn't do it. I still think 1 year's paid leave creates choice. It doesn't mean you can't go back to work if you want to, you're not tied, but it means that there's a choice between, and baby care is very expensive and very difficult. As Kathy already alluded to, domestic care is good for babies. It's very hard to deliver high quality care for under ones. It's not impossible. I've seen some nurseries that do it brilliantly, but it's very hard and very expensive. 1 year's paid leave, I think, would be a better option, and that's why we made the recommendation. And the third thing, and I'll be very quick because I know I'm running out of time, is that in my career, I'm always in a room talking about poverty and disadvantage. But usually it's on health inequalities or education inequalities or high crime rates or mental health problems. And there's always Michael Marmot's social class gradient. So money is always associated with a whole range of poor outcomes. So why not less poor? You know, if the problem is money, give them some money. That seems to me pretty basic. And we did do it. You know, we did have child poverty. And child poverty, you take people's benefits away, duh, people get poorer. This is not amazing. You know, I hate the expression not rocket science, because actually it's all much harder than rocket science. I think it makes people feel stupid to say it's not rocket science. It is. It's harder. But anyway, so I think that our last recommendation is, one of the biggest issues, Mike will say a lot more about what the big issues are in the benefit system, is just take away the two-child limit. You know, the poorest families have more children, and that means more children are poor if you take away if you have the two-child limit. And it has plunged about 800,000 children into poverty. So the two-child limit has not worked as a policy to have people have fewer children, but it has worked as a policy to have a lot more poor children. And those are our recommendations, and I open for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Kathy. Yes, absolutely. So now I'm going to invite Mike and Iram to join me on stage for the panel discussion. And while they take a seat, I'll introduce them briefly. So Dr. Mike Brewer is now Chief Scientist and Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, where he oversees the foundation's research agenda. He's also a visiting professor at the Department of Social Policy at the LSE and the author of a book, What Do We Know and What Should We Do About Inequality? And before the Resolution Foundation, Mike worked at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the University of Essex, where he did a lot of work on childcare and parental employment. And last but not least, Professor Iram Siraj. Iram is a professor of child development and education, the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. She held previous positions at UCL and Warwick. She's directed a number of influential longitudinal studies on the impact of preschool and primary education, and she's done a huge amount of work on the quality of early education and childcare. So we're delighted to have you here, and I'm going to ask you to start the discussion with 5-minute reflections on the report, and then we can open it up for a broader discussion. Mike, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and for inviting this. What a fantastic paper that is. I mean, congratulations to Naomi and to Kathy and Vanessa for funding it. I mean, when the new government comes into power, if they want to know anything about early years and how to close the gaps, just give them this paper, right? I mean, it tells, that's what you should do. I guess I wanted to draw out 2 points and make one extra point to throw into the mix. I'll start with how Naomi finished with the two-child limit and the benefit system. I'm really pleased that the paper stressed that. Because the context is very different from a decade ago, and let alone 15 years ago, the last time people were talking an awful lot about early years and childcare. So there's always been a gap between the sort of poverty and deprivation between large families and smaller families. Back in 1997, about 1 in 4 children in 1 and 2 child families were in poverty, whereas about 40% for larger families. And that gap shrank in the 2000s. We're getting towards convergence. And then since 2013, it's been diverging again. And our forecasts, we published a year ago, were in 5 years' time, still about 1 in 4 children in 1 and 2 child families will be in poverty, but it's going to be double that, about half. of children in larger families will be in poverty, so worse than 1997. So the context is completely different from the late 2000s. Now, it's not exclusively an early years issue, obviously. Children, it affects children of all ages. But it's, and it's also not just a statistical artifact. We showed in research last month, which I think came out just too late. We've mentioned in your paper, Naomi and Kathy, but just showing that children in large families are twice as likely to be in material deprivation, twice as likely to be in food insecurity, and much more likely to use a food bank. So with that much inequality going on before children step foot in any kind of early year establishment, it is really important to focus on income as a way of closing gaps. That's point number one. Point number two, I've been drawing perhaps on my previous work looking at childcare and the links with mothers' employment, is to comment more on the mixed economy that we have here. And my take, well, indeed, what the paper says, if you go into the detail, is that the authors would like the PVI sector to be more like the maintained sector in terms of funding, and they recommend that government fund that properly. They also recommend that the maintained sector be more like the PVI sector. And here they're talking about specifically weeks per year. And I don't want people to forget about that. So the paper makes the point that many children start off in the maintained sector, start off in PVI, move into maintained. What's the big change that parents experience when that happens? They go, oh my gosh, it's gone from 48 weeks to 38 weeks, and I've gone from open 8 to 6 to open 8 till 3. And this isn't just me as a middle-class dad complaining about how hard it was for my children to find childcare. This is a genuine issue that affects many parents, particularly mothers, and it does restrict the work they can do. So the maintained sector does need to be more like the PVI sector if childcare is to help mothers work. And then my third point, I guess, keeping on the theme of employment, and at the risk of throwing too many things into the pot, is I just wanted to remind people about the nature of today's labour market and the nature of employment rights. And for those of you in the room who think about childcare primarily as a way of increasing mothers' employment, you might wonder, when we provide free childcare, why don't so many parents move into work? Well, it's in part, it's because, have you seen the nature of today's labour market, particularly for low-skilled and low-paid workers? It's not just with low pay, insecure work, one-sided flexibility. We had a great statistic in something we did a couple of years ago. We asked parents what their employers would do if they had an emergency affecting their children that meant they had to take some time off work. And for those who are paid less than £20,000 a year, more than half of them would have to take a day off without pay. If you earned more than £50,000 a year, your employer would pay you. So the labour market's got that inequality built into it as well, which is compounding the other inequalities that we've already touched on. So I'll leave it there, Sarah.
Thank you, Mike. Iram?
Thank you very much. From the research that we've been doing and the research that a lot of other people have been doing, we know already that the period to make population change, if you want to make population change, is birth to 7, when children are developing at their most rapid. We also have a great deal of evidence from research about the impact of the early home learning environment. So I don't think, again, that we can ignore the role of parents and homes in uplifting practice. I get the opportunity to look at other systems in the world, which makes me incredibly fortunate, but it also makes me think about the advances that we've made already before this paper was written. We have gone to one ministry instead of 2 or 3. That was a huge problem, and many countries still have that problem. We've widened access to early childcare and education, and again, that's something that Andreas Schleicher from the OECD talks about as being something easier to do. It looks good, and it's cheaper than the kinds of things we read about in this paper. And thirdly, we have tried to deal with quality uplift. We've done it through national measures like the Early Years Foundation Stage and the Early Years Foundation Stage Profile, and Ofsted, and the 2 measures that Ofsted take in our 2-tier system. I think the paper's really excellent in bringing us back to quality, because again, that's harder to develop, and many of us have been working in research and in practical ways to uplift that. And the paper says a great deal about it and actually goes into a nuanced understanding of what quality looks like. The paper also looks at the power of the early home learning environment and therefore talks about parenting support and workforce uplift in terms of their education and their flexibility. But of course, the things that get in the way of flexibility are working conditions and unions and so on. So it's not an easy thing to change. But I think there also need to be links to existing structures, and I really like the idea of the children's campuses on primary schools. But then the reality of what that would mean for leadership at that primary school level and the buy-in from trusts and academies to integrate the child development services. I think so much depends on how much society is willing to invest in a new vision and infrastructure. Can we rise above the two-tier system of the PVI and the maintained? You know, that's a huge challenge that maybe the paper didn't drill down into sufficiently. But I think it's a very hard thing to do, and I understand that you had a limited amount of space and that it is as complex as rocket science. So just a few points. I think that from my point of view, the paper really got me thinking a little bit more blue skies. And I think some of the things we need, and I had a long discussion with a friend at Columbia University who is working on policies in the States. And they are literally thinking of improving tax credits and giving poorer families quite substantial sums to lift them out of poverty, but she told me not to mention the sums. So firstly, I think we do need to think about a joined-up vision, the continuum of what I'd like to think of as development and health. And I'll tell you why I'm talking about development and health rather than education and care. The Marmot Review is one of the elements because of the link between poverty and early education, the two substantive areas that can help lift families and children. I'd like us to take away the care discourse, because if we talk more about development rather than care, then we can also link child learning with adult learning. And this is where the kind of vision that Naomi was talking about becomes so important. Secondly, direct services to parents and children really requires the right infrastructure of linking services with a focus on quality. And the focus is on quality, but it also supports the wraparound learning and relational pedagogy that children need to support them while parents are at work. Another aspect is using the tax system. Tax credits to poorer families probably need to go beyond the child benefit system. That's my personal feeling. I really love the idea of lifting what we've taken away from families, but also maybe if the point is to raise the lowest 40%, and in particular the lowest 10%, then I think we really do need to think beyond that. The whole issue of joined-up thinking requires different systems to work together. It requires the Treasury to work with the Education Department, to work with the Health Department. And some countries are doing that. I mean, last year I had the opportunity to talk to policymakers from Kazakhstan, from Estonia. In Estonia, they have 18-month maternity leave, and then after 18 months, there is universal provision till 6. And that's well thought through, and it makes sense. The parents still pay a small amount of money, about 300 euros a month, for the childcare from 18 months onwards. In Kazakhstan, the maternity leave is 3 years. As the children get older, the funding goes down, but it allows those parents who feel they want to parent at home, because I do think parents should have the right to do that as well, can be supported during those 3 years, and then there is universal service from 3. So it has been done in some countries. And finally, I think that this does require long-term thinking. And if we take the baton for long-term thinking, then we could also understand that this could generate big benefits economically over that period.
Thank you very much, Iram. So, yeah, a set of really interesting points. I wondered, Naomi and Kathy, whether you wanted to respond, or I can kick off with some questions for discussion. Okay. So, look, the report and, again, our panelists' comments and reflections have really set out a vision where we have 3 sort of really major pillars, one around high-quality childcare provision, a more generous sort of safety net and financial bedrock for families, and an improved and integrated support system for families and young children. Now, obviously, this is a vision, and this was the report was set out and asked you to set out your vision for 2040. I wondered whether you had any thoughts on how we go from now to 2040. What should be the balance between these 3 things? What should we prioritize? Taking Mike's point about the importance of the welfare system, is it even worth thinking about integrated forms of family support when so many families are in dire poverty? So any thoughts on sort of priorities and balance between all these things, or at least the sequence in time? Yes, Kathy.
I'll be really brief. The first step, I think, must be the workforce. I mean, the workforce, particularly the workforce in the PVI. And so, I mean, all the other is important, but that's where we have to start. Naomi?
Yeah, I agree about the workforce issues, and I agree it's the first step, not the least because the most frustrating part of it is that we know what to do. It's the strongest evidence base in terms of better outcomes for very young children. So the difficulty with the other forms of family support and all that is that the evidence is more complex and more difficult in terms of, we know that the home learning environment is the most important thing, and I always say, gee, if only people would do what I tell them to do, it would be great. But we don't have the same kind of clear roadmap in terms of, so how do you improve the home learning environment? And I think improving the home learning environment has a lot to do with reducing the pressures of poverty. But the reason I would start with early education, as Kathy says, is because we know what needs to be done. And also, if we're in terms of wider policy issues, there's a lot of people working in early years in childcare who are on universal credit. If you think about gender equality, it is a female-based workforce that is poor themselves. So it would be a double hit in terms of equalities policies to start there.
Can I just summarize really quickly? The EPSI team is very fond of saying there are 2 levers in terms of changing children's development. The really big, strong one is the family. About half a size, we know from all kinds of fixed effects, longitudinal studies, the effect of early childhood is half, the effect sizes are half of the family. But what I say is we know a lot how to change this weaker lever, and we don't know a lot about changing the other. So that's the quick summary.
Thank you.
And why we came up with our recommendations.
Iram and Mike?
I mean, the bioecological model that many people adhere to, which, says the proximal factors are critical for children's development, I think shows quite clearly that, parents are very powerful, but then they can be powerful in negative ways as well as positive ways. So the second chance children get after the lottery of birth is the early years workforce. And if we have a highly trained workforce, children then get a stronger proximal protective factor once they enter early education and development, I won't say care. So that really does make sense, because you're investing in something that is going to have a long-term benefit. But how we do that is a really big issue. I recently went to a webinar where the DFE were explaining how they're going to roll out this huge expansion of childcare. And, 16 weeks of training with a rushed through to level 3 isn't the practice uplift that we're talking about. So at the moment, policies are reversing. There are many, many attempts through the impact hubs and other work to practice uplift, but the early years workforce can't see the remuneration for that and the value of that for themselves. So I think at the moment, we want the same thing, but the routes to them are challenging.
As to where should we start? I mean, that feels a bit like the impossible debate between cash first or services first. I think, well, in reality, the series of reforms that Cathy and Silva have set out, some of them are sort of doable quickly by a new government, and other ones require institutional or structural change and will naturally happen more slowly. So, I mean, I think in reality, if I was advising a next government, it would be, well, this is 2040. You can only, you're going to have to start somewhere. Just get started where you can, but make sure you keep your eye on the long-term price, because some of the things actually will be quite difficult and will meet resistance on the way.
Thanks a lot. So you've just said again, and all of your report tries to rely a lot on what we know from the evidence. And you've just said that we know how to increase the quality of childcare. We don't necessarily know how to strengthen the home learning environment, at least at scale, I suppose. So I wondered, what for you are the sort of key questions that people working on generating evidence should be working on, between now and 2040, so that by then at least we have the set of knowledge that we need to have an evidence-based, support system.
Funnily, I mean, in terms of research questions, there have been a few that have dogged me for years. And one of them, in terms of integrated family support, is the next baby. It's always worried me in the model of, community support at local level and, supporting people into doing the right thing for their kids that isn't discriminatory and isn't, So by the time you kind of begin to think, gee, that's a good idea. Maybe reading to them every night's a good idea. Maybe sorting the socks when we do the washing and the colors is a good idea. But by then, the focused child is already in school. But funnily enough, women have other babies. And I'm just curious about the family, the impact on the next child, which nobody's ever looked at. So that's one piece of research that I think is interesting in terms of whether there really is a payoff in that kind of family support work, which has always been very ephemeral. So that's one. The other one is the balance in terms of cash payments. See, I think cash payments are important because it's miserable to be poor. I don't think it's, I'm old now, I can say what I want. I don't think it's just about early childhood development, all that. I just think it's miserable to be poor, And therefore, the question is, how long does it take for cash payments to begin to have an impact on child outcomes? And that I don't think that we really understand. So if you're going to argue cash payments to have better long-term child outcomes, how long does it take? How much money does it take? Those sorts of things, I think, when you're beginning to balance the policy choices, are the research that I find very difficult. But I would just give them the money because it's awful to be poor.
I mean, in 1997, I think Tony Blair gave a speech about the kind of poverty that New Labour was going to try and deal with in that administration. And I think he said something quite profound. Yes, Tony Blair did say something profound once about poverty. He said one is the material kind of poverty that Naomi's talking about, but then also there's the social and cultural poverty that some families experience. It's linked because it's linked to the experiences children have, the things they can hand language onto, and so on. But I think that the workforce issue is a big one. I want to go back to what Kathy said, where we don't have a cadre of professionals that our children should have an entitlement to, a cadre of graduates who are reflective, who understand children's development from a health and education perspective, and who know how to work with adults to support their children. Now, that doesn't seem to me like rocket science, but the point I'd want to research, actually, Naomi raised, which is what kind of leadership does it take to provide that kind of service? And particularly at the level, if we already have infrastructures that we can hitch our wagon to, like primary schools, I'm not saying they should be the only ones where children's campuses can develop, can we pilot the leadership support that those schools can develop to offer the extended services, not just something latched on like nursery classes which get ignored, but a real support for development of communities in those spaces. So some research around the leadership side.
Thank you.
I don't think I have anything to add to this question.
No worries. So the report is very much focused on English provision, but you do say that there are implications and messages that can be relevant for the other UK nations. I wondered whether you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that, thinking about examples in Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland, where we can learn to do things better in England, or whether you also foresee differences in the institutions, politics, or cultural norms between England and the developed nations that may make getting to the vision harder or easier.
Jerome knows about Wales.
Perfect.
I think in both Wales and Scotland, the things they've done well is a continuum of the curriculum from 3 to 18. So they're not separating out the early years, foundation stage, and then reception different from 3 and 4 and so on. Also, they've taken on the baton of the early home learning environment, I think, and invested in that more. They've also shrunk their PVI sector, I think more by chance than planning, but they have very small PVI sectors compared to England. England has expanded hugely the PVI sector as a way of expanding access at the expense sometimes of quality. So I think there are differences, but all of them, I think, have failed on the workforce front. If you look at the advertisements for recruiting early years staff, they're still very much embedded in that care discourse rather than early education. And that worries me immensely. And quite a lot of the high quality early education work that's being done, for example, by the EEF and the impact hubs and so on, a lot of it is voluntary for people. A lot of it is not remunerated. A lot of it is excellent, but it's not getting into the teacher training courses necessarily, or the initial training courses. So that joined up thinking isn't happening as much as I would like it to in terms of quality and integrated working. But I think it's happening a bit more. But on the other hand, in Scotland, they've leveraged the preschool age to 6. So children are getting, for a longer period of time, a lower education, if you see what I mean. My Scottish friends will not be happy with me, but there you go.
Thanks.
I mean, oddly enough, fairly recently, I was invited to speak at a Shorstock conference in Belfast. And I didn't realize that Belfast had maintained so many of those key principles. And it was a really interesting, it was very, really nice. But I'm not sure, I mean, what the evidence is for that impact. Is there any do we know what's worked and what hasn't worked? Because I don't see the same quality of evaluation and reflective thinking. I see much more the classic, we just think this is a good thing to do. And it's great, because then people come along and they feel really good about it. So I would want to look at the Northern Ireland experience and say, well, what have we learned? What's different? Has it made a material difference that they're still investing in this sort of, because that might give us some pointers to the future. Scotland, I should know more. I would say that they have consistently failed in their mainstream education system. And I don't quite understand why, but they haven't done well on education. And they've thought a lot about early years and done some very good reforms on early years, but their mainstream education system still is not where it should be.
Thank you. So before we turn to the audience for questions, I still wanted us to turn towards the audience and realize that we have here in the room and also online probably around 150 people. Most of them have been working on the early years for a long time. We have researchers, policymakers, practitioners, a lot of representatives from the third sector. And in the report, you talk a lot on the role of government, what government should do. But I wondered whether you could speak a little bit as to what the role of this community of people who care very much and spend their working lives thinking about the early years should do to support the vision that you have for 2014.
I would say the hardest, I chair an integrated care board for the NHS, for Northamptonshire, for 2 local authorities. So it's all the health services for a population of 800,000 people. I've been doing it now for 3.5 years. For the first 2 years, I could not get children on the agenda at all. So I'm pleased that Iram has talked about health a lot, because the key issue in health is basically Kathy and me. It's the aging population. And the trouble is that these policy areas are in competition with each other. They're in competition for airtime. The board I chair until very recently had nobody but me who knew anything about children, had any history in children's services. So there was nobody who in their bones, well, what about? So if you could work in your communities and at national level on just what about, that just don't let it be forgotten. And we need some way to build, this was my dream, and what I was trying to do within the healthcare system that I'm involved in, is what would an early intervention approach look like that's life cycle, where we're not competing with one generation against another, which says, what are the best things you can do in the early years that make it more likely that children will thrive in the next stage? And you could do the same thing for the working age population. We have an absolute disaster in terms of illness in the working age population. So what are the things that you do before frailty to make sure that people don't get frail? So it seems to me that if you took it in a life cycle approach to early intervention, everyone has some skin in the game. And that, so in terms of your communities or the way that you argue, it's being careful not to argue one generation against another, but to argue some key principles which are about the bottom half of the income distribution and what do you do to ensure it's more likely rather than less likely that the next stage will be better. Sorry, that's very ranty.
All right. Well, we'll start with questions from the audience then. Yes, maybe we can take 2 or 3 at a time. Please introduce yourself before asking your questions.
My name is Peter from Homestart UK. You get to a certain point in life where you don't listen to new music anymore. The bands that you used to like come back together. So I just say thank you to everyone here who's done so many years of brilliant work. It's like a reunion. And I wish we could change this faster. We know some of the answers, so it's great to hear. From a Homestart perspective, I just wanted to make a quick point about the role of the voluntary sector. over the last few years, the voluntary sector has held up so much in communities. We all know that. And there doesn't look to be any sort of way out of that. And so certainly a lot of the recommendations could help deal with that in terms of welfare, in terms of professional workforce. But I wonder what people feel about what we do to invest in the voluntary sector. At Home Start, we're dealing with two things daily. The first is poverty alleviation in a way that Home Starts never have done over the years. So we can't help a family till there's food in the fridge. And at the other end, we're dealing with more complexity of need that isn't being dealt with by other services. So the voluntary sector is taking a real weight. So what could we do to support the sort of hidden parent people in communities? And when you talk about systems leadership, what can we do to bring the voluntary sector leaders in and alongside the leaders you're talking about in terms of development? Thank you.
Are you okay that we take?
Yeah.
Take at the back, Eleanor.
Hiya, Eleanor Island from the Nuffield Foundation. Increasing funded entitlements for working parents from 9 months is going to be popular with working parents who are voters, because it's obviously going to increase the amount of money that they're paying for childcare. But improving the conditions, pay, qualifications, and of the early years workforce may not be so popular. So how can we persuade any incoming government to take on board your important findings, given that we probably don't have time to change the value that we as a society place on early childhood between now and the next election?
Thank you. And then there is a third question here at the front.
Thank you. I'm Will Millard. I work for SQW. I've got two hats on today. The first one is that we're running several evaluations with an early years focus, one for the innovative new ARC Start provision across London, but hopefully further afield soon. And the second is a 5-year Mercer's company-funded evaluation of various different community-focused early years programs. My second hat is that I'm a parent of a now 2-year-old. He turned 2 last week. And I've got one broad observation to make and then one question for you. So the broad observation is that I think the recommendations are fantastic. I've sent a picture of them to my partner with the hallelujah emoji underneath. I think they're really brilliant. So thank you for those. The question is just thinking actually outside the state. My partner's experience was she ended up taking a year's maternity leave. The final 3 months were completely unpaid. And, you know, we're by no means on the breadline, but it was a struggle. We were down to one income. So her employer said you could have the full year, but if you don't come back after that year, you have to repay it. And so my question is this. It's, we're talking a lot about what the state can do, but what carrots and possibly sticks do you think we might have for employers and actually encouraging employers to behave in a way which values all of this slightly more highly? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have one question around the PVI, the role of leaders in PVI, how we can support them. Then Eleanor's question on how we can persuade governments to take on board some of your recommendations, and then the role of employers, the role that employers can play in again, supporting some of your recommendations.
So 2 quick points. First, I think the Graduate Leader Fund, which we had, 12, 15 years ago, was quite well researched. We found that those settings that use the funding to make a graduate leader, they improve the quality of their practice. That's pretty good observational data. So something like the Graduate Leader Fund, which of course is voluntary, it's any sector. But the other quick point, it's a little off the wall, but when you said what kind of new research, I was at Lego in January and talking to the taxi driver in Denmark and talking about his taxes, you know, they were so high. And he said, we don't mind, well, he said, not we don't mind. He said, we pay these taxes because the services we get, they're really worth it. So when you said, what kind of research? Everybody's thinking early years, can we do research? How do we get the public to see that more taxes will get to be like my taxi driver in Denmark? I mean, he really said, yes, it's expensive, but I get all this. And that kind of research we really need to do. Nesta would be good at this, for example. It's off the wall suggestion, but
Thank you.
But the problem at the moment is we are paying high taxes, but we're getting rubbish services. So, you know, it doesn't always work. It's only if it's well managed. And again, you know, I just want to say, in relation to a couple of the questions, the lady at the back from the Nuffield, there's so much evidence now that the wealth of a nation is dependent on early childhood. The Front Project in Australia has papers from PwC, from economists around the world about the benefits of early years in two ways. One is supporting parents to go out to work and how that supports the economy, and workplace socialization, how that improves people's mental health and parenting. And the second is in terms of quality early education provided by trained teachers alongside other professionals. A lot of work has been done as to what that helps children with in terms of school readiness, in terms of longer term attainment, and therefore lack of other services, other problems like health, employment, incarceration, and so on. So I think what we need to do is use those arguments for the big economics in terms of long-term returns, and we can show quite easily that early education and early learning, whether it's maths or language, has implications for health later on, employment, and so on. I really think your question is very important about the role of the third sector in supporting early years. I think the third sector has suffered greatly under recent administrations. I think there's been unfair competition for funding and lots of cuts, and I understand why that is. But when I think of systems like Portage that we had, do you remember which were superb, and your Home Start, and the need out there is growing, but the sectors that we're helping is shrinking. And I do think, again, that we need some further training for leaders, particularly in primary schools and early years, on how to work more collaboratively with NGOs and charities in leveraging and supporting their work, but also getting benefit from it. I don't know how you do that because I'm not from that sector, but I know it's really important.
And just talk about the employers. I'm always a little bit sceptical about how easy it is to get employers to do something different. I think the employers who recognise that improved maternity rights or flexibility of parents generates better retention and a better workforce, are doing it anyway. And I could have read out I read out a statistic about taking time off for emergencies. I could have read out exactly the same statistic for statutory for maternity pay. It's basically it is much more likely to be low-paid women who are reliant on SMP, and higher-paid women are much more likely to have employers who are more anyway. So I do think there's an important role for regulation to set the minimum backstop. And if you push up the minimum in terms of pay, it's not a burden on all firms because the good firms are doing it anyway. But it's making sure that the worst employers, the ones who are trying to cut corners, are held to this kind of standards that we all would like all firms to behave by.
Can I just pick up a couple? I was going to make the same point about employers. I think the problem is that the higher paid you are, the more likely is that you're going to get the kind of employment benefits. So it increases the inequality, and you want to level up, not level down. But on the voluntary sector, I mean, the main issue has been the massive cuts to local government because it's largely funded through local government. And I think that we need to, I mean, a big political push is about reinvigorating the role of local government. This is the thing that's worried me most about academies, because it separates out education from having responsibility for a group of children in a locality. So it makes the relationships much more complicated, even though I'm not saying all local authorities were great at running schools. They not all were. Some were good, some weren't. But the idea that you solve a problem by setting up a new way of structuring it rather than actually trying to solve the problem. But the most important point I want to make is to disagree with Iran, because I think this is quite important. See, I think all the arguments you make on what the evidence says are completely right and absolutely irrelevant to the voter. And I mean, I'm going to say, Gordon Brown was always accused of doing good by stealth. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing good by stealth. I honestly don't think that those arguments are going to hit the voters, because, the people who vote and listen to those arguments and all that are pretty much okay. Then I think that government has a responsibility for those people who aren't pretty much okay. And I think the reason why we're all so excited about whatever happens in whenever the election is that it gives us 5 years. So you can do the most interesting and the radical things in the early part and hope they work well enough so that they become embedded into the system as you go through the cycle. And we haven't had that opportunity in quite some time. So I think the difficulty is much more is do good under the radar so that it doesn't disadvantage the people who think they're going to win out in what's been promised, while at the same time trying to rebalance the effort. It's a very tricky business. And, democracy sucks, but it's the best we have. But once you've promised people a lot, then you say, I'm going to take a little bit of it away, they get very anxious, no matter what evidence you tell them about why you're doing it. So I think we have to make the case for policymakers and for the advisors and the SPADs and the ministers to be of either party in terms of the science, but in terms of the public, try to figure out a way to do it that's the least worst option for the voting public. It's a very hard trick.
Great. So we'll take those 3 questions in the room, and then maybe we'll get some questions from online.
Thanks. I'm Matt Buttery from Triple P. I'd like to echo Pete's comments about getting the band back together. It really is good to hear the wisdom coming back into the discourse. I'm curious about 3 things, and I wondered whether they might be linked. Kathy, 2 things that you said. First of all, you said if we were asked to write a report about mental health, it would have been a different report. We've then had a conversation about the 4 nations, and I know for me, when it comes to parenting, one of the good things that Scotland's done is the NHS have put quite a lot of money in through POP, the Psychology of Parenting programme. So they are working with local authorities, but I think you've got better join up, and I'm suspicious, I think that's what's gone on in Northern Ireland as well, so that you've got more harmonisation, joining up of budgets. And I think the place in which parenting is positioned in England in particular is problematic because it's in local authorities who've got less than no money. But then, Kathy, you said another point, which was that we don't know as much about changing the family environment. And I know in the report it talks about we haven't got things that are cost-effective, simple enough to scale, attractive enough to enjoy high uptake. We've seen international examples of where that's not true at all. And I'm wondering whether this link between, are we taking too nuanced a question or too narrow a question? And should we be thinking more about, when we think about parenting, the impact of family across mental health, the kind of early education, etc.? Because the population reach of some of the work that was done by the Health Service Executive in Ireland, interestingly combining health and more early social care prevention budgets, was somewhere in the region of 25% of parents in a 2.5-year period did an evidence-based parenting program, Triple P, in a proportionate universalism model. Similar in the US, Queensland, there's a paper about to come out which is saying, now bringing digital into that fray, again, about 15% of parents have uptaken, and we've seen shifts in child maltreatment, we've seen population shifts in mental health. So I'm wondering, has your exam question been narrowed slightly too much? And do we need to take a slightly wider view when it comes to parenting in particular?
Okay, and Laura. Oh.
Just to say, today you haven't explicitly highlighted the issue of the fact that early education and care funding is being targeted increasingly at working families and then potentially excluding the more vulnerable families. I mean, it's very implicit in your recommendations. And I just think, how do we kind of, and I think this is slightly building on your point, Naomi, how do we kind of get the message across that this is a crucial phase for early education and particularly benefiting the more vulnerable, whilst, do we then take some of the money away from that has been promised to working families of 9 months plus? I'm just thinking, how do we kind of deal with this issue?
The gentleman.
Hi, I'm Neil Halfin from UCLA, and I'll just start off by saying that I realized this was a cross-cultural experience because I didn't understand the difference between PVI and maintain. So my comment might be coming from left field a bit, but having worked with Naomi for many years, I have some basis for this. There's the old adage that every system's perfectly designed to produce the results that it's producing. So you have a system that's designed to produce poverty. It's designed to do all these things. And when we usually talk about transformation, usually you have to have some disruption of that system to move. And I wasn't quite seeing the disruptive stuff in this rather than just the incremental improvements. My big question is, to have joined up anything, you have to have everybody who's joining up focus on the similar outcome. You can't have me as a physician focus on health and the next person focus on education. Have to have something common, bigger than all of us, that we all want to work for. Jeffrey Rose, the famous English epidemiologist, talked about how to go at problems either by bringing up the tail of the curve or shifting the entire curve. In progressive universalism, you try to do both and shift the whole curve. And I know that also, if we're going to work on health, development, and education, you have to take an ecosystem approach. And what we're doing mostly is a developmental ecosystem approach. How do we characterize the developmental ecosystem? One of the things that I'm just curious about is that the Australians, the Canadians, and us in the US over the last several years have shifted one of our strategies to measuring school readiness or healthy development and well-being at a neighborhood level in relationship to what's happening in neighborhoods, and then getting local government, mayors and city councils to sort of say, we have a problem here, how do we work with you? And what that does is it generates an outside-in strategy, not just an inside-out strategy. And it's not just the service sectors reaching out to the community. The community starts to say, what can we be doing to do things forward? And it's an ecosystem approach rather than a service system approach. And I've just been curious over the last 20 years, these other English-speaking high-income countries have moved a different strategy to use data in a very different way, and why hasn't that happened here?
That's easy to answer, but I won't. So, Kathy, do you want to start? Because the first one was...
So the first question was on
Yes.
parenting programs, and then we had a question on the fact that the childcare subsidies are now increasingly targeted at working families. So how do we reconcile that with the fact that this is really leaving out a lot of very vulnerable families? And then the last question.
I think the first question illustrates, the problem that we had in terms of the brief, which was very specific about school readiness age 5. And as we were doing the work, I kept wanting to answer a much wider question, and then was brought back to, nope, this is the question. So basically, I think that mental health is really important. I think social skills are really important. I remember saying to Kathy many, many years ago, when I first decided to go into early years, when I was at University of California, San Diego, it was during the Vietnam War. And I mean, it shows what an idiot I was and just how crazy I was as a 21-year-old, is I thought, if we get this right, well, boys just won't join up. It'll be fine. Nobody will want to be a soldier. If we got early years right, who would join the army? Boy, I was so clever, wasn't I? So, so in terms of the wider purposes, there are wider purposes. There are certainly issues in terms of mental health, which is becoming critical issue in this country, and of course is very impacted by the resilience that's developed in early years. But we stuck to a brief, and as Kathy says, and we said, we would have had we would have had 2 volumes if we tried to do the lot, and we couldn't do that. So I think that it was right to stick to the brief. On Laura's point, that's why we went down from 30 to 20, so that we equalized at 2 children of non-working families as well as children of working families. And children of non-working parents, as much as you don't guarantee, we used to think that if you're working, you're not poor. We know now that isn't true anymore because of flat wages and all that. But the corollary of if you're not working, you're much more likely to be poor is true. And I used to say, gee, I wish I could figure out how to not work and not be poor, and it's called retirement. So it's way too late. And Neil's point, it's interesting about system disruption. I just think I'm not creative enough. I mean, I understand the point you're making, but I am an incremental person in terms of what I think governments would actually do. And the difference between the UK, well, England and the US is England is highly centralized in policy. So there isn't the kind of opportunities to do things at local level in the way that there is in Australia and the US. I mean, I don't mean just the difference between state level, I mean between state level and local area level and community level. There's much more local decision making in the US than there is in England.
Yeah, Kathy?
I want to go to the mental health and parents. I think in the children's campus model that we propose, which is really very linked, it will mostly be in primary schools unless there already is, a family center. I think that is where the voluntary, the private, they all come together, the childminders. And I agree, had mental health been our outcome and not school readiness at age 5, the family would have had to be much, much more important. But I think I work with primary teachers, and they really are concerned about mental health. And schools really want to work in mental health. I mean, they're driven by academic outcomes. So I think that the campus model, the link to the primary school, and teachers are on our side on this, and that I agree with you on the parenting programs. Yes, sorry. And I think that the campus would really be the center for the parenting programs, and the voluntary sector has a terrific role to play. So we were thinking about it.
I guess the only thing I found disappointing in the report was that all the services were universal, and I get the argument for the compositional effect of benefit to children of having universal services and the lack of stigma and so on. But I would have liked to have seen, because you can either give money directly to parents or you can give money indirectly, and one of those ways would be to have full-time provision for children who are more disadvantaged backgrounds. So parents have got more time to go to work, or respite if they're looking after disabled family members or whatever. I think that is one way of supporting, and it also allows more time with those children to do work with families and joined up thinking with NGOs and voluntary sector. I think your point about why we don't do something like the AECD in Australia every 3 years, kind of community child development measure that tells us some things. I can't see that it's been terribly effective in places like Australia. It's immensely expensive every 3 years. And when I have sat on committees for Victoria or South Australia or New South Wales, I feel they've got lots of, they're really data rich, but then they're kind of information poor, because that then isn't being driven sharply into raising quality for preschool or other programs. It's kind of there. People know that, you know, South Australia's gone downhill, and, Western Australia's gone uphill, but they don't know why. And I have had people conjecture about those things, and the people in the fields have really, really good understanding, but the policymakers, I think, don't really know how to use that data terribly well, and often they go off on tangents in funding aspects in health and so on, but not looking at the bigger picture. So somewhere where it is working well, and yet you've got outcomes increasing and being better, you actually look at what they're doing, and they're doing more joined up thinking. They're putting into place a lot more preschools, so there's community-sensitive child care and development going on, but then they're also targeting high quality through some of their Thrive by 5 programs, you know, the Telethon Kids stuff and so on that you'll know about. So you can disrupt and disaggregate what's working, but actually what people want is models of what works so that they can then emulate those models. But I think it's very, very difficult to bring all policy together in that way, because you see in different states sometimes ideologically driven stuff going on in one sector and then more evidence-based in another sector, and the two aren't articulating. I think it's great to have data, but there's, like you said, there's got to be a purpose for what is the outcome for that data. Are we all working towards driving up children's development, or, you know, what are we working towards? And then what does it look like in the preschool primary sector? What does it look like in health and in terms of other kinds of support?
Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything? I just wanted to ask whether there was maybe one question from the online audience. No? Okay, well, anyway, we were out of time. So, well, I just wanted to thank again very much Kathy and Noemi for their superb report, and Iram and Mike for very, very interesting contributions to the discussion. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today and for your interesting questions. We have coffee and biscuits outside. Please join us, and we can keep this conversation going for another half hour. And thank you again to all of you.